The rain came down in sheets the night they took the wrong woman. Hannah Reyes pulled her thin coat tighter and hurried along the wet sidewalk outside the Warwick Hotel, where she'd just finished a double shift behind the front desk. Chicago in November had a way of soaking through everything: shoes, coat, patience, and all she wanted was the warmth of her tiny apartment and the small ritual of the kettle. She never heard the black SUV slide up behind her. She never heard the doors open. She only felt the hands, two of them, enormous, closing over her arms before she could scream, and then a third, pressing something soft and chemical over her mouth. The city smeared into wet neon streaks. Her keys hit the pavement with a small, useless clink. The last thing she saw before the darkness swallowed her was her own reflection in the tinted glass, wide-eyed, terrified, and utterly certain there had been a mistake. There had been. She woke to warmth, which was the first thing that made no sense. Kidnapping victims, Hannah thought dimly, were supposed to wake up in basements, concrete, cold. Instead, she was lying on a bed larger than her entire bedroom, beneath a blanket that felt like water made into silk. In a room lit by the amber glow of a fire, she could hear crackling somewhere to her left. Floor-to-ceiling windows showed the whole glittering sprawl of Chicago far below, rain streaking the glass like the city was weeping for her. She sat up too fast. The room tilted, and the fear came all at once, a cold flood that started in her chest and spread until her fingers shook. She pressed them flat against the silk to still them. Think. Look, you're good at looking. It was the only thing she'd ever been good at, really. 9 years behind a hotel desk had taught Hannah to read a person in the 3 seconds it took them to cross a lobby. The businessman hiding a shaking hand, the couple whose smiles didn't reach their eyes, the con artist with a stolen credit card and a too-easy laugh. She read the room now the way she read those strangers. Someone had undressed her out of her soaked coat and left her otherwise untouched. Someone had lit the fire. Someone wanted her comfortable. Someone wanted her calm, which meant someone wanted something from her. You're awake. The voice came from the shadows near the fireplace, and it was the kind of voice that made the air feel heavier, low, unhurried, a voice that had never once in its life needed to shout to be obeyed. He stepped into the firelight, and Hannah's breath caught somewhere below her ribs. He was tall, dressed in black with his sleeves rolled to the forearms, a glass of red wine held loosely in one hand as though he'd been waiting a long time and intended to wait longer. His face was all hard angles and cold patience, a jaw carved from something colder than stone, dark eyes that moved over her the way a man takes inventory. Handsome in a way that felt dangerous, the way a blade is beautiful right before it's used. She read him too, because she couldn't stop herself. And what she read frightened her more than the gun she could see holstered under his arm. Nothing, no tell, no tremor. This was a man who had removed every window into himself years ago and bricked over the frame. You have nothing to say, he observed. That's new. I don't. Her voice cracked. She swallowed and forced steel into it. I don't know who you think I am. Something flickered across his face. Amusement, maybe, or the shadow of it. That's a very interesting way to begin, Sophia. The name landed like a slap. Sophia. Of course. Of course. Hannah closed her eyes for one endless second and understood everything the way you understand a car crash. A half second before impact, too late to do anything but brace. Her sister. Her reckless, laughing disaster of a twin who called only when she needed money and vanished the moment she had it. Sophia, who had shown up at Hannah's apartment 2 weeks ago with a wild look and a new coat and said she'd gotten tangled with some serious people but would handle it. Like always. Sophia hadn't handled it. Sophia had run, and this man had come looking for the face they'd been given. Hannah's face. My name, she said carefully, is not Sophia. The man set down his wine. He crossed the room without hurry, each step measured, and stopped close enough that she could smell cedar and something darker underneath. He crouched to her eye level, and up close his gaze was worse, not angry, but assessing, patient, the look of a man who had all the time in the world and none of the mercy. Do you know who I am? He asked quietly. No. Dante Lombardi. He let the name settle. You took something from me. $4 million in my trust, which is worth considerably more. You smiled at my face across a table. You shook my hand, and then you disappeared like smoke. His head tilted. Now tell me again that you're not Sophia." Hannah's heart was slamming so hard she was certain he could see it. Every instinct screamed to keep insisting, to explain, to beg, but she read the room one more time. The comfort, the fire, the wine. And then, underneath it, the holstered gun and the flat, patient nothing in his eyes. She understood two things at once. He would not believe the truth, and the moment he decided he had the wrong woman, she stopped being useful, and a man like this did not leave loose ends breathing. The realization crystallized, cold and clear. To live, she had to become her sister. "Fine," Hannah said, and lifted her chin, hating the tremor she couldn't quite kill in her voice. "You found me. Now what?" Dante went very still. For just a moment so brief she almost missed it. Something moved behind his eyes that she couldn't name. Then he smiled, slow and without warmth. "Now," he said, "we get reacquainted." What Hannah did not know, what she would not learn for many days, was that Dante Lombardi had realized the truth before she'd even opened her eyes. He had a file on Sophia Reyes, photographs. The particular careless music of her laugh caught on a wire, the way she held a cigarette, and the small crescent scar on her left wrist from a bar fight in Miami 2 summers back. The woman sleeping in his guest bed had no such scar. She had soft hands that had never held a weapon, a service worker's careful posture, and a face that, while identical in every line to the woman who'd robbed him, wore an entirely different soul. His men had grabbed the wrong twin. Any other night, Dante would have corrected the error with a phone call and a shallow grave, because he was not a sentimental man, and the world was full of people who died for other people's mistakes. He'd reached for his phone to give exactly that order, and then she'd opened her eyes and, instead of collapsing, instead of weeping and confessing, she had done something extraordinary. She had looked at him, really looked, the way almost no one dared, and he'd watched a strategy assemble itself behind those frightened, intelligent eyes, and then she had gambled her life on a lie. "Fine, you found me." She was terrified. He could see her pulse hammering in her throat, could see her fingers pressed flat against the silk to stop their shaking. And she was pretending she wasn't playing a role she'd invented in real time, wearing courage like borrowed armor, 2 sizes too large. Dante had spent his entire life surrounded by people who feared him and hid it badly. Here was a woman who feared him completely and hid it magnificently, and who had, in the space of 90 seconds, read the entire room and reverse-engineered exactly what she needed to become to survive it. He put his phone back in his pocket. "Let's see," he thought, "who you really are." The days that followed were a performance staged over a knife's edge. Dante installed her in the penthouse, his penthouse, she learned, 60 floors above the city in a fortress of glass and silence. There were men everywhere, unsmiling men in dark suits who watched her with flat, professional eyes. And there was Marco, Dante's second, a heavyset man, with a gentle face and cruel hands who clearly did not trust her at all. "He's watching you," Marco told her on the second day, apropos of nothing, as he set a plate of food in front of her. "You know that. He's always watching." "Good," Hannah said, with a lightness she didn't feel. "I'd hate to be ignored." Marco's mouth twitched, almost a smile, and he left. She survived on instinct and observation. She learned the penthouse's rhythms when the guards changed, which rooms were locked, how the staff moved and what they feared. And every night, alone in the enormous bed, she conducted a quiet war with herself. "You are afraid of him," she told herself in the dark. "He took you. He is letting you believe you'll die if you slip. Whatever you feel when he looks at you is not real. It's a rabbit's gratitude toward the wolf that hasn't bitten yet." She'd read about it once, in a magazine at the front desk on a slow night, the way captives could bend toward their captors, mistake proximity for feeling, mistake survival for love. She recognized the shape of the danger. Naming it was supposed to make her safe from it. It did not make her safe from it, because the man was not behaving like a wolf, and that was the problem her careful mind kept snagging on. Hannah could not stop being herself. When one of the younger guards, a boy really, no older than 19, dropped a tray and flinched like he expected to be struck, it was Hannah who knelt to help him gather the broken glass. Murmuring that everyone dropped things, that his hands were shaking, and had he eaten today? The boy stared at her like she'd grown wings. So did Dante, from across the room. When the housekeeper's daughter got sick, It was Hannah who noticed the woman's red eyes and quietly sat with her, and who, remembering 100 worried travelers at her desk, knew exactly the right thing to say. Sophia would never have done these things. Sophia took, she did not give, and every act of unthinking kindness widened the crack in Dante Lombardi's certainty until it became a canyon. But Hannah's real gift showed itself on the 4th day, and it changed everything. She was carrying a tray of coffee into the study she had insisted on making herself useful, partly out of habit, partly because a moving target is harder to corner when she passed the room where Dante held his meetings. 3 men stood around him, and Hannah, who had spent 9 years learning to tell the honest guest from the one about to skip out on the bill, stopped in the doorway because one of the men was wrong. His name was Tommaso. She'd learned that much. He was mid-level, trusted, a fixture at Dante's table, and everything about him that afternoon was calibrated a half-degree off. He laughed a beat too late at Dante's dry remark. When Dante mentioned a shipment coming through the docks on Thursday, Tommaso's hand drifted just for an instant to his jacket pocket, the small, unconscious gesture of a man checking that a phone was still there, that a secret was still safe. And when the meeting broke, Tommaso's eyes went to the door, to the window, to the exits, the way a man's eyes go when he's already somewhere else, already gone. Hannah had watched 1,000 people lie across her desk. She knew what it looked like when someone had already decided to betray you and was only waiting for the moment. She should have said nothing. Saying something meant caring whether Dante lived, and she was not ready to admit she cared. But that night, when he came to stand beside her at the great windows, a habit that had formed between them without either acknowledging it, she heard herself speak. The man from this afternoon, Tommaso. She kept her eyes on the storm outside. Don't tell him anything you don't want your enemies to know. Dante turned his head slowly. Explain. He's frightened, and he's hiding it, and he checked his pocket when you said the word Thursday, like there was something in it he was afraid you'd see. Men who are loyal don't watch the exits during a meeting with their boss. Men who are planning to run do. She finally looked at him. I could be wrong. I've been wrong before, but I don't think I'm wrong. For a long moment, Dante said nothing. Then, quietly, where did you learn to see like that? The front desk of the Warwick Hotel, she almost said. She caught herself. Around. He studied her with an expression she couldn't read, and Hannah, who could read anyone, found that maddening and thrilling in equal measure. 3 days later, Tommaso was found to be selling shipment routes to the Verano organization, the rival family pressing at the edges of Lombardi territory. Dante had said nothing, moved nothing, changed the Thursday shipment to Wednesday, and let his enemies waste a hard-won ambush on an empty stretch of river. Tommaso disappeared. Hannah did not ask where. But something had shifted. When Dante looked at her now, there was a new thing layered under the fascination, respect, sharp and reluctant. She had not saved herself with kindness alone. She had saved him with her mind. And that, she was beginning to understand, was far more dangerous to them both. The Empire did not pause for one man's fascination. The war with the Veranos was no longer a rumor at the edges of things. Hannah pieced it together from tense phone calls and half-heard fragments. The Veranos were old money gone hungry, a family that had ruled the South Side for 2 generations and watched their power bleed away to the younger, colder Lombardi. Now they were pushing back, testing, leaving bodies as messages, and they had heard something that delighted them, that the woman who had robbed the great Dante Lombardi was living in his penthouse, unpunished, unburied. It made him look weak, it made him look compromised, it made her a target and, worse, it made her a symbol, a thing the Veranos could take from him to prove he could be taken from. She learned exactly how much of a target on a grey afternoon when Dante took her for reasons he did not explain to a restaurant he owned in the old Italian quarter. A show of normalcy, perhaps, or a test of her nerve. They were seated at a private table in the back, and for the length of a single glass of wine, Hannah almost forgot her circumstances, almost enjoyed the strange intimacy of a meal, with a man who watched her mouth when she spoke and pretended he wasn't. And then, over his shoulder, through the front glass, she saw a car slowing on the wet street outside, slowing wrong. 9 years of watching the lobby doors screamed at her, the way they'd screamed about Tommaso. Dante. She was already moving, already reaching across the table for his arm. The car! Get down! The front windows exploded. It happened in half a heartbeat. The roar of an engine, the stutter of automatic gunfire, glass turning to 1,000 glittering knives in the air. But Hannah's warning had bought a half second, and half a second is the difference between the living and the dead. Dante was already over the table, already around her chair, and then his whole body was covering hers, one arm cradling her head to his chest, the other braced against the wall as he drove them both down and behind the heavy oak of the bar. Bullets chewed the plaster where they'd been sitting. She was crushed against him, against the wild slam of his heart, breathing in cedar and gunpowder, and through the deafening chaos she felt his voice more than heard it, low against her hair. "I've got you, I've got you." The gunfire stopped. Tires screamed away into the rain. And still he didn't let go. He stayed curled around her on the broken glass, shielding her body with his own, checking her frantically for wounds with hands that, she realized with a jolt, were actually trembling. "You warned me," he said, and there was something raw in his voice she'd never heard. "You saw it." He caught the blood then, blooming across his own shoulder where a bullet had grazed him, and dismissed it entirely. "You saw it before my men did." "You're bleeding," Hannah whispered. "You're alive," Dante said, as though that were the only fact in the world that had any weight, and pulled her closer. And Hannah, staring up at the most feared man in Chicago as his blood dripped onto her collar and his arms refused to release her, felt the careful wall she'd built inside herself crack straight down the middle. "This isn't the rabbit and the wolf," something in her said, quiet and certain and terrifying. "He put his body between you and the bullets. Sophia's debt doesn't buy that." She hated how much she wanted to believe it. That night, in the penthouse, she cleaned and stitched the wound on his shoulder herself, because he refused a doctor and she refused to let him bleed. He sat shirtless and silent on the edge of the bathtub while she worked, and the intimacy of it was almost unbearable, her fingers against his skin, his eyes never leaving her face, the small, careful sounds of thread and breath in the tiled quiet. Her hands were steady, her mind was not. "You are stitching a wound in a man who kidnapped you," she told herself, "and you feel safe. Something is broken in you, or something is real, and you're too frightened to tell the difference." The two thoughts circled each other and would not resolve. "Why did you do it?" she finally asked. "Cover me. You could have run. You could have let me." She didn't finish. "I don't know. It was," she sensed, the most honest thing he had ever said to anyone. "You're supposed to want me dead. I stole from you." Dante caught her wrist gently, but she froze. His thumb moved once, slowly, over the pulse point there, over the smooth, unscarred skin, and his eyes came up to hers, dark and unreadable. "Did you?" he asked softly. The world stopped. "He knows." The realization crashed through her. "He knows. Since when? How long is he?" "Finish the stitches," Dante said, releasing her, his face closing like a door. And she did, with trembling hands, and neither of them said another word. The not saying was louder than any confession, and she lay awake half the night, trying to decide whether the thing she felt when he touched her wrist was terror or its exact and unbearable opposite. The truth about Sophia came out 3 days later, and it came out cruelly. Sophia called. Not Hannah's phone, Dante's men had that. She called the penthouse's main line, because she was reckless and arrogant and had always believed she was the smartest person in any room, and because she'd heard, through the poisonous grapevine of the underworld, that her sister was still alive in Dante Lombardi's home. Something about that seemed to have genuinely infuriated her, as though Hannah surviving were a personal insult, a theft of something Sophia was owed. Hannah wasn't supposed to hear it, but she was passing the study when Dante put the call on speaker, and Sophia's voice, her own voice, warped through the phone, stopped her cold in the doorway. "So you figured it out, huh? Took you long enough." A laugh, light and terrible. "Yeah, that's my sister you've got. Hannah. Sweet, boring, dependable Hannah. Everybody's favorite." Hannah's hand found the doorframe. "You want to know the funny part?" Sophia went on, and now there was something underneath the arrogance, something old and rotted. "I gave your guys her name and her picture on purpose. Figured they'd grab her, figured you'd do what you do, and I'd walk away clean with your money while you buried the wrong twin. And honestly, I've wanted to do something like that my whole life." Her voice thinned. "You have no idea what it's like. growing up with a face that's not even yours alone. Everyone always looking past me to her. Why can't you be more like Hannah? Hannah's so kind. Hannah's so good. Hannah never gives us any trouble. 30 years of being the disappointing one. The dark twin. A brittle pause. So yeah, when I needed a body to close your debt, I picked hers. Felt like justice. Hannah couldn't breathe. It wasn't only that her sister had tried to have her killed. It was that she was hearing, for the first time in her life, the true shape of the thing that had always lived behind Sophia's careless laugh, a jealousy so deep and so old it had finally eaten her whole. Hannah had spent 28 years covering for Sophia, paying Sophia's debts, forgiving Sophia's cruelties, and telling herself her sister loved her underneath it all. There was no underneath, there was only this. So do us both a favor, Sophia was saying, bored again, the rot tucked back out of sight, and finish it. She was always going to die for me eventually. Across the study, Dante Lombardi's face had gone to something beyond cold. Hannah had seen him controlled, seen him dangerous, but she had never seen this, a stillness so total it was its own kind of violence, the quiet of a gun a half-second before the trigger. "Sophia," he said, and his voice was almost pleasant, which was the most frightening thing of all. "Thank you. You've told me everything I needed to know." He hung up, and then he saw Hannah in the doorway. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Everything hung exposed between them, the lie, the truth, the plan, the fact that he had known and said nothing, the fact that her own blood had sold her for scrap and called it justice. "You knew," Hannah whispered. "How long?" "The first night." He didn't look away. "You have no scar on your wrist." "She does. I knew before you woke up." The betrayal of it, a smaller betrayal stacked on the enormous one, took her breath. "You let me think I was going to die. Every day. You let me believe." "Yes, no excuse, no softening." "Why?" Her voice broke on it. All the fear and grief and impossible longing of the last 2 weeks came out in that one word. "Why would you do that to someone?" Dante crossed the room to her, and this time when his hand rose, he did not stop it. His fingers curved along her jaw, warm and impossibly gentle for a man built from violence, and he tilted her face up to his. "Because," he said, low and rough, "I wanted to know who you were when you thought your life depended on the lie. I've spent 30 years watching people show me their worst selves the moment they're afraid." His thumb brushed her cheekbone. "And then there was you, terrified every single day. And every single day you were kind. You knelt down for the boy who dropped the tray. You sat with the housekeeper. You stitched a wound closed for a man you had every reason to let bleed. You saw a bullet coming through a window and your first instinct was to reach for me." His voice dropped further, almost to nothing. "I've spent my whole life around people who would trade me for far less than $4 million. And I cannot make sense of you. So I watched. And the longer I watched, the less I wanted to stop." Hannah's eyes burned. "My sister just told you to kill me." "Your sister," Dante said, and the tenderness vanished into something lethal, made the last mistake of her life. And Hannah, standing in the wreckage of every story she'd ever told herself about her family, about her captor, about her own traitorous heart, did the thing she'd been fighting for 2 weeks. She stopped fighting it. "I should hate you," she said. "You should. You lied to me. You let me believe I was dying." "Yes, and I don't." Her voice shook. "I don't hate you, and I've spent every night trying to convince myself that means something's broken in me, that it's fear pretending to be something else. Tell me it isn't. Tell me I'm not losing my mind." Dante pressed his forehead to hers, and she felt him exhale like a man setting down a weight he'd carried for years. "If you're losing your mind," he murmured, "then we're losing it together. Because I have not slept a full night since they carried you through that door, and it has nothing to do with the war, and everything to do with the way you look at me like you can see the man underneath. No one has ever wanted to see that man. You don't even want to. And you see him anyway." He did not kiss her. He was, she understood, waiting, leaving the last step for her to take or refuse, this terrifying man who took everything he wanted, holding still for the one thing he would not take. Hannah took it. She closed the last inch and kissed him, and it was nothing like the rabbit and the wolf. It was 2 people who had both been alone their whole lives, finally, foolishly, dangerously choosing not to be. He did not kill Sophia. What he did was, in its way, far more complete. Over the following week, With Hannah watching and to her own quiet horror not stopping him, Dante Lombardi dismantled her sister's escape piece by piece. The stolen 4 million, wired through a chain of shell accounts, was found and frozen. Sophia woke one morning rich and went to bed the same day with nothing. The new identity she'd purchased evaporated. The men she'd fled to received a very calm phone call from a very powerful man and decided, overnight, that harboring Sophia Reyes was not worth the attention it would bring. I could end it, Dante told Hannah quietly one night, watching her face. You know I could. One call. I know. Hannah stared out at the city. The thing that horrified her most was how long she considered it. Don't. Not because she deserves mercy. She doesn't. Because I'd have to live in a world where I let it happen, and I already have to live in a world where I love you. That's as much as I can carry. Dante looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded and made no call, and Hannah understood she had just changed him in some small, permanent way, and that it had cost him something to let her. Cornered, broke, and out of allies, Sophia did the only thing she had left. She went to the Veranos Dante's enemies and offered them the one thing she still owned, everything. The layout of the penthouse, Dante's routines, the identity of the woman he had, to the astonishment of the entire underworld, fallen for, and the location, on a specific stormy Thursday, of the safe house where he'd take her when the war finally boiled over. She sold her sister a second time, and this time, she made sure she'd be there to watch. The Veranos came for Hannah at the lake house. Dante had taken her there to keep her safe, a beautiful, isolated place on a stormy stretch of coastline north of the city. All weathered wood and tall windows full of grey water. For 2 days it had felt almost like a dream, like they were two ordinary people and not a mob boss and the woman he'd stolen. They talked, in the way of people learning each other late and hungry. She told him about the front desk, the years of reading strangers, the sister she'd loved past all sense. He told her fragments of a childhood that explained the bricked-over windows in his eyes. They were not fixed, either of them, but they were, for 2 days, held. The Veranos came on the third night, in the teeth of a storm. The power died first, then the alarms, then the door. What followed was chaos and terror, armed men in the dark, muzzle flashes strobing the beautiful rooms, Dante shoving her behind him and returning fire with a cold precision that spoke of a lifetime she would never fully know. Marco fell defending the stairs, and Hannah heard herself sob his name, this man who had never trusted her and had died between her and a bullet anyway. Glass and rain and blood. And through it all, Dante fought his way to her, took her hand, and ran, dragging her through the storm toward the boathouse and the black water beyond. They almost made it. Sophia was waiting on the dock. She stood in the driving rain with a gun in her hand, and it was the strangest, most sickening thing in the world for Hannah to look across 10 feet of storm and see her own face pointing a weapon at her heart. Sophia was soaked and shaking and wild-eyed, ruined, all her careless glamour washed away into something desperate and small. You ruined me, Sophia screamed over the wind. I had everything. I had a way out, and you couldn't just die like you were supposed to. You never could just let me win. Sophia Hannah started forward, and even now, even here, her voice was gentle because she could not help it. Sophia, please, look at yourself. This isn't you. Don't. Sophia's face crumpled and hardened all at once. Don't you tell me who I am. You have no idea who I am. Nobody ever bothered to find out, because you were always right there being perfect and good and loved, and I was just the copy. The one they'd have returned, if they could. Her voice cracked into something almost like grief. I used to lie in bed and wish I'd been born alone. Just once. Just one thing that was only mine. And Hannah, who had spent her whole life absorbing her sister's cruelty and never once understanding the wound underneath it, felt her heart break clean in two, even now, even with a gun aimed at it. It was never a competition, Hannah said, tears and rain running together down her face. I would have given you anything. All you ever had to do was ask. I loved you. I still, her voice failed. Put it down, please. We can still. For one suspended second, Sophia hesitated. Hannah saw it. She read it. The way she read everything. The flicker of the girl her sister might have been if the world had loved them evenly. The gun wavered. Something moved across Sophia's ruined face that might have been the beginning of the word sorry. Then a Verano gunman's shout cut through the storm behind them, and Sophia flinched, and the moment shattered, and Old Poison won the way Old Poison always had. "No," Sophia whispered. "No, you don't get to be the good one more time," and she raised the gun. Several things happened at once. The gun fired. Dante moved again, always, without a heartbeat's hesitation, throwing himself into the space between the muzzle and the woman he loved. And Hannah, who had spent her whole life protecting a sister who despised her, and who had spent 2 weeks learning that she would rather die than watch Dante Lombardi bleed, did the one thing no one expected. She threw herself sideways into him, all her weight, knocking him off his line so that the bullet meant for her heart tore through the meat of her shoulder instead of ending her. She went down on the wet dock. The world went white with pain. And Dante Lombardi, seeing Hannah fall, seeing her blood spread pink across the rain-slick wood, made a sound she had never heard from a human being, something torn out of the deepest part of him, and rose to his full height with the storm behind him and death in his eyes. Sophia never got off a second shot, but it was not Dante who stopped her. The Veranos, in the chaos, in the dark, saw only a figure with a gun standing over the fallen woman they'd been paid to eliminate, and they did not know Sophia from Hannah, did not know one twin from the other, had only ever been given one face. Their gunfire found her in the storm. Sophia Reyes fell on the dock a few feet from her sister, sold out at the last by the very men she'd tried to sell everyone to, undone by the identical face she'd spent her whole life resenting. Hannah, bleeding, reaching across the wet boards toward the sister who had just tried to kill her, screamed a name into the storm that the wind tore away. Then Dante's arms were around her, and the world went dark. Hannah woke, for the second time in her life, to warmth. This time she knew where she was before she opened her eyes. The antiseptic hush of a private room, the beep of a monitor, the weight of a hand wrapped around hers. Her shoulder was bound and screaming, but she was alive, and when she turned her head she found Dante Lombardi asleep, in a chair pulled as close to her bed as it would go, still in his blood-stained clothes from the dock, holding her hand in both of his, like a man holding the last warm thing in a cold world. He woke the instant she stirred, and the look on his face, the naked, undefended relief of it, undid her completely. "You're awake," he breathed. "Sophia." It came out as a question and a plea and a grief all at once. Something passed over his features, gentle and terrible. He didn't lie to her. She would always love him a little extra for that. "She's gone, Hannah," on the dock. It was the Veranos, they couldn't tell the difference. "I'm sorry." Hannah closed her eyes. The tears came slow and hot, and she let them, because whatever Sophia had been at the end, she had also once been a little girl who lay awake wishing to be born alone, and someone in the world should mourn that girl, and there was no one left but Hannah. She hesitated, Hannah whispered, "On the dock, before." She almost put it down. "I saw it." "I know," Dante said quietly. "I saw it too. That's the sister I'm going to remember, the half-second version, the one who almost her voice broke and she let it. He held her hand and let her grieve, and did not fill the silence. And it was, in its way, the kindest thing he had ever done. After a long while, when the worst of it had passed through her, she opened her eyes. "You threw yourself in front of a bullet for me. You threw yourself in front of one for me first." His thumb moved over her knuckles. "You had every reason to let me die on that dock, Hannah. I kidnapped you. I lied to you. I let you spend 2 weeks believing you were living on borrowed time." His voice cracked. "And you knocked me out of the way and took a bullet in my place. Why?" And Hannah, brave, kind, brilliant Hannah, who had spent her whole life being the sister nobody chose, looked at the most dangerous man in Chicago and gave him the truth she had finally, fully stopped hiding from herself. "For weeks I told myself what I felt for you couldn't be real," she said, "that it was fear, survival, a trick my own mind was playing to keep me alive." She turned her hand in his, palm to palm. "And then I saw that gun, and I didn't think about survival at all. Every instinct I had was to keep you breathing, even if it cost me everything. That's not a rabbit fearing a wolf, Dante. A rabbit runs." I stepped in front of the bullet. Her eyes filled again. "Somewhere in all of it, you stopped being the man who took me, and you became the man I couldn't lose. Dante Lombardi, who had never in his life knelt to anyone, lowered his head to their joined hands and pressed his lips to her fingers, and stayed there a long time, and when he looked up, his eyes were wet. "Then don't," he said. "Don't lose me. Stay. Not as her, never as her. As you. As Hannah." He drew a breath that shook the whole hard architecture of him. "I've spent my whole life making sure I never needed anyone, because everyone I ever needed used it against me. And then a woman I stole by mistake read a traitor across a room, warned me of a bullet before my own men saw it, mourned a housekeeper's daughter, and grieved a sister who tried to kill her." His voice dropped, raw. "You are the most dangerous thing that has ever happened to me, Hannah Reyes. You made me want to be someone who deserves you. Marry me. Let me spend the rest of my life earning what you did on that dock. I'll burn every empire I have to keep you safe. Only stay." Outside the window, the storm had finally broken. Grey dawn was seeping over the lake, turning the water to hammered silver, and the rain had softened to something almost gentle. Hannah looked at him, at this cold, terrible, devoted man who had frightened her and shielded her and seen her, truly seen her, when the entire world had spent 28 years looking past her to her sharper, prettier twin. She thought of Sophia, who had wanted so badly to be seen and had burned the whole world down chasing it. She thought of how close she'd come to being just another body in another debt. And she thought of how strange and terrible and true it was that she'd had to be kidnapped by the most dangerous man in Chicago to finally be looked at by someone who saw all the way down. "On 2 conditions," she said. "Anything. No more kidnapping." A watery laugh broke out of her. "You want a woman, Dante Lombardi. You ask her to dinner like a person." His mouth curved a real smile, maybe one of the first of his whole hard life. And the second, Hannah's face went quiet and serious. "You helped me bury her properly, Sophia. A real grave, a real stone. Whatever she did, she was mine. She was the only family I had, and I won't let her go into the ground like she was nothing. Even if she'd have done it to me." Her voice steadied. "Especially because she'd have done it to me. Somebody in this story has to choose to be better than the worst thing that was done to them. It's going to be me." Dante looked at her for a long, still moment. This woman who could stand in the wreckage of her own family and choose grace, who had knelt for a frightened boy and read a killer across a room and stepped in front of a bullet and now asked, of all things, for the dignity of the sister who'd sold her. "Yes," he said, and his voice was thick. "Yes, all of it. Anything you ask, for the rest of my life." He pressed his forehead to hers. The monitor beeped steady and sure between them. The dawn came up gold over the water. And in a quiet hospital room far above a city that would never stop being dangerous, the wrong twin who had turned out, all along, to be exactly the right woman, laced her fingers through his, unscarred against scarred, and let herself, finally, be held. They had grabbed the wrong sister off a rainy Chicago street. She read a traitor before he could strike. She warned a killer before he could fire. She stepped in front of a bullet meant for the man the whole world feared and mourned the twin who put it there. It was the only mistake Dante Lombardi ever thanked God for. They grabbed the wrong sister off a rainy Chicago street, and somewhere between a stolen night and a bullet on a storm-soaked dock, the woman nobody ever chose became the one thing a dangerous man could not live without. In the end, Hannah didn't survive by becoming harder. She survived by staying kind in a world that begged her not to, and by refusing to let even a sister's betrayal make her cruel. If Hannah earned a place in your heart tonight, leave a like so her story finds the people who need it. Subscribe to stay for the next one, and share this with someone who's ever felt overlooked, someone who deserves to be truly seen. And tell me honestly, if you'd stood on that dock, could you have chosen to bury the sister who tried to bury you?